This is, I think, a credit to our brilliant panelists. Needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Graham Allison, a professor, Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard Kennedy School, and also the popularizer of the concept of the Thucydides trap, which we'll be talking about a little bit today, obviously pertinent to the topic. Here we have Belén Garijo, who's the chair and CEO of Merck. Next to her is Robin Niblett, who used to run Chatham House, now is a distinguished fellow at Chatham House, and I think I've known you nearly 20 years. Anyway, quite a long time. Great to see you. And then Fred Hu, last but not least. When I met Fred Hu, he was running Goldman Sachs in China. That is 20 years ago, actually, this year. And he literally has not changed at all in 20 years. I've got white hair, I'm getting older, but this man has not changed at all. He is now, and has been for quite a long time, the founder and chair and CEO of Primavera Capital, one of the leading investors, maybe even the leading investor out of China, and an old friend. So my name's Jamil Andolini. I run Politico in Europe, but I spent 22 years of my life living in China, primarily working for the Financial Times. And 3 years ago, I disrupted myself and I moved, I joined Politico and I moved to Brussels. And when I spoke to some of my contemporaries at the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they were very scornful. And they said to me, Jamil, what are you doing? The news is all in Asia, the news is all in China. Europe is a news desert. And I was a little bit worried. I thought, God, this is late 2021, remember? And I thought to myself, gosh, this is a bit worrying. Maybe they're right. And I arrived and Mr. Putin proved them completely wrong, sadly. And since then, there's been a roller coaster. I'm actually an American who spent most of my life in China, who now lives in Brussels. So who better to moderate the panel we'll be speaking about today, which is the topic of the United States, Europe, and China, the triangle. What does it mean? What does the future hold? With all the changes we're seeing in the world, I think this is a very, very important topic, not least for us here in Europe. So I'd like to turn to you, Professor, first of all. You popularized, you I guess, invented this idea of the Thucydides trap. Why don't you, for those of us, many of you will know what this is, but why don't you just very briefly explain what that is?
Well, I thank you very much. It's an honor to be on the panel with such a distinguished group. And I think your characterization of it's right, Thucydides had a big idea. And unfortunately, too many people today who don't read don't know who is Thucydides. So just for 1 second, he's the father and founder of history. If you've never read his book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, shame on you. I don't think you should participate in strategic conversations if you're not familiar with him. So that's just a professor's advertisement for a second. As a Chinese friend of mine says, I've the best press agent Thucydides ever had, because there have been more copies of his book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, in Mandarin, sold in the 7 years since I published my book than in the previous 2 millennia. So good for Thucydides. Thucydides' big idea was that when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens to displace a major ruling power, most often this turns out to be a war, and frequently a catastrophic war. So he wrote about the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta. His one-liner, which is probably the most frequently quoted one-liner in Western national security studies, is it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war almost inevitable. I look at this in my book, Destined for War. Last 500 years, 16 times we saw rapidly rising power, seriously threatening major ruling power. 12 ended in war, 4 in no war. A war inevitable? No. Likely? Yes. And if I were taking the situation today, I think if Thucydides were commenting, he would say, more or less, we're right on track.
For a war.
For a war. This looks like...
Between China and the United States.
Between China and the U.S. And my old colleague and mentor, Henry Kissinger, who died a year ago, the last 2 years of his life, every couple of weeks, he would call up and say, Graham, I'm hearing more and more echoes of 1914. more and more similarities, because when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens a ruling power, it's like a seesaw of power, and it's shifting. And what does it shift? It shifts my perception. I used to be looking down on you, now I'm looking up. It shifts my psychology. Who the hell do you think you are? Why are you challenging me in this area, this area, this area? It affects the politics. I used to be able to push buttons and something happened. I push the button and now some of the power is drained to you, and it doesn't happen. Maybe the contrary of the thing that I thought. So this pattern, as a rising power seriously threatens a ruling power, I mean, it's rooted in even animal and human behavior, ultimately, if you think about it in an established incumbent and a disruptive upstart. And the dynamic is somewhat like it, but in the national situation. I think, to conclude, though, the structure, in my view, and in Thucydides' view, Thucydides was not a fatalist. He says he was right. He wrote this book because people screwed up in ways that they could have done otherwise, and he was hoping they would learn something from it. So the same thing with my ambition or aspiration. I'd say 75% of the story is in the structure. So that's why, if I were betting it, I think the next decade or two we'll see a catastrophic war between the US and China. If I were betting, okay? And Henry thought that. But that still leaves 25% of agency for actors. And I think intelligent actors in Beijing and in Washington and in Europe could conceivably do things differently, some of which they might even do now. So I said on Monday or Tuesday, whenever the first show was, I'm trying to be as optimistic as I can. I believe a year from now, we will have been surprised on the upside in the US-China relations.
So I have two quick questions for you. One is, in a catastrophic war between the United States and China, who wins? That's one question. And the second one is, if the US and China are going to engage in a catastrophic war, what role does Europe have to play?
Okay, good question. So, again, problems with professors talk too long, but in a mad world in which you have, quote, mutual assured destruction, which occurs when two powers have nuclear arsenals large enough each to destroy the other after they've been attacked, there's no winners, because if I succeed in killing every last one of you at the cost of erasing my country from the map, as Ronald Reagan kept reminding people, a nuclear war cannot be won. Because if at the end of the war, however much you've done to the adversary, if you've lost your own country, don't put that in the win column. So I'd say that's the two stories for, it's a good way to lose-lose. A war between the US and China doesn't have to escalate to a nuclear war, but would likely do so, because otherwise somebody loses at a stage in an escalation ladder in which they could take another step hoping that you would stand out. So that's, and I'm sorry, what was the second?
What's Europe's role in that scenario, in a war?
Well, I mean, it's conceivable you could duck. But I think a world after there'd been a catastrophic nuclear war between the US and China has enough other climatic and effects. As, could be a nuclear winter, could be this or could be that. I think Europe has a role to remind the major actors in Beijing and in Washington that we live on a small planet, and so don't screw it up.
Robin, I'd like to turn to you and ask you whether you agree that we're headed for 75%, I think you're saying, chance that we're headed for a catastrophic Sino-US conflict.
Well, fantastic to be on this panel. I think of it as the US-Europe-China panel, especially as I'm a Brit. I'm not sure if I should speak on behalf of the EU, but obviously Europe includes the EU, and the EU doesn't include the UK anymore, but that's fine. But let me just, and when I look at this idea of it being a triangle, I find it amusing that the EU or Europe is stuck in the middle, because in a way, although it looks like it's a power of the same size, if you look at defense budgets, collectively larger than China's, you look at GDP, it's ahead of China's at the moment, though less than America's. Of course, Europe can't make decisions as Europe the way the United States and China can. So I always find the triangle thing very interesting. We might get into that later on, but I don't want to duck your question. Where would Europe stand on this? Of course, it would all depend how the war started. And if the war started where it was sensed that China was the aggressor and America was having to defend the values that it has also defended in Europe for the past 80 plus years, there would be pressure for many European governments, certainly those in NATO, to join. So I don't think this would be an EU question. This would be a NATO question at that point, although it's outside the North Atlantic area, so it's not technically a NATO question. It would present leaders with an almost impossible choice. Of course, you know, the UK's nuclear capability is deeply interconnected with America's. France's is not, so there's some interesting dynamics there. I just think we could get into a conflict, I think, as Graham was saying, so far short of outright war. Interesting question might be, what would we do if China blockaded Taiwan? And America treated that sort of as an act of war, but not one to lead right up the escalatory ladder that Graham described and got going. Would Europe, the EU, UK, step forward and maybe try and help break that blockade? There it gets interesting. And I think that if we look at where we are today, Trump has come into power, so it adds complexity. We might come to that later on. But Europeans depend more for their security today on America than they did when you were over there and before you came back, pre the full-scale invasion. And therefore, part of our way of telling America, stay with us in Europe, help us deal, at least while we transition to maybe being able to take on Russia for ourselves, can't at the moment, is to show that we care about security in Asia-Pacific as well. So we've seen closer relationships with Australia, deepening of security relationships with Japan. You've had freedom navigation operations in the Indo-Pacific involving Dutch, the British, the French, the Italians. So at the moment, we are trying to say to America, stay with us in Europe, we'll be with you in the Indo-Pacific. Now, that had been the kind of Biden deal. Yeah, of course, we're now post-Biden, clearly, and it all gets a lot more complicated. Maybe I'll just stop there, I'll speak for too long.
Yeah, of course, the danger of that, to go back to Henry Kissinger's analogy, is Europe is aligning itself with America. We'll help you in Indo-Pacific, but you help us with Russia. That sounds very much like sleepwalking into conflict, as we saw in 1914.
It's either sleepwalking into conflict or it's effective deterrence. I think we're in a world
that's
where...
what they would have said in 1913, well, effective deterrence.
I believe humans learn.
Yeah.
I really do. And if we look at how we've handled the global financial crisis, we learn. China has learned, definitely. Does not want to make and repeat mistakes of previous great powers, definitely not that of the Soviet Union. So I'm on the more optimistic end of the 75-25, and I think as a European, we definitely want to be on the optimistic side of that calculation.
Madam Grillo, one of the ways traditionally we've thought about of how to avoid conflict like this is closer economic integration and better aligning the interests of the big industries. If you think about the founding of the European Union, how did we do it? We got an economic coal and steel agreement so that we wouldn't have to fight each other, because the interest of all of us is in making more money and not fighting. How do your company is very large in both the United States and in China. How do you see that economic integration? Do you see it disintegrating? Do you see it coming? I don't think you see it coming closer, but maybe you do. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with this prestigious panelist. Look, let me tell you in few words how important the three continents are for Merck. Our heritage and our headquarters and our operations are proudly European. We have the largest percentage of the workforce in the US and the largest source of revenue in China and Asia Pacific. So we are a real global company, right? And we have operated flawlessly in the three continents simply because we have been able to use our strength and our resilience and fully understand the expectations and how to compete in these countries. So Europe, the US, and China are highly interdependent and interconnected. They are competitive rivals, but they are also trading partners, right? And they are, in a way, strategic allies. So I don't think conflict is going to be good for anyone. It's going to cost a lot of money.
Absolutely.
Especially
for
by that.
Especially for you.
Not for me. Not for me, for the world.
For the world. Put it another way, setting aside who's at fault or anything, do you see it getting more difficult to have a position like yours? As you said, main workforce in the United States, main revenue in China, heritage from here. Is that getting harder with Donald Trump's election, with Xi Jinping's turn inward, and Europe's? What would we say about indecision?
Let me put it this way. We prepare for risk scenarios, for all kinds of risk scenarios, because the main topic that we are confronted with at this time is volatility and uncertainty. Everybody speaks. We have heard recently Mr. Trump, the president of the Commission, has made major commitment to address big roadblocks on European competitiveness, but this is going to be a multi-year effort, right? Getting Europe more competitive is going to be a multi-year effort, and we need to move with a speed and the sense of urgency that is required to catch up on certain topics. Innovation and growth, to generate an environment in Europe that is favorable to the industry and to growth, to future growth, sustainable growth. So is it more difficult for us to compete? The answer is yes and no. We are operating differently, definitely yes, and as I mentioned, preparing for risk scenarios. But something that I have noticed during the conference this year is that the tonality, both coming from President Trump and also from the from the President of the European Commission, is actually much more positive on China. Because they need each other, and they are now much more realistic on our ability to enter any kind of de-risking, decoupling, you name it, right? And Trump stated yesterday during the connection to all the audience at Davos that he was expecting to be closer to China, to collaborate with China. Do we believe that or not? It's still to be seen, right? The same has been said by the President of the Commission. So I think, my aspiration, our dream, what we are trying to do in each and every country is obviously use our resilience of having played in China for almost 100 years, in Europe for 356, and in the US for many more, right? To establish our operations with very strong proximity to our customers in order to be able to serve our customers and patients in the best possible way.
So you referred to Europe needs to move quickly and get its act together. As I say, I've lived in Brussels for 3 years now. And when I first arrived, I thought I was leaving, China to move to a place with the clean air of democratic freedom. And I arrived and I was like, wow, this is more bureaucratic than communist China. Like, this place moves slowly. And I have a theory that the election of Donald Trump and his sort of animus towards multilateral institutions, particularly the European Union, that is perhaps just the sort of existential crisis that the European Union needs to get its act together. Because we have seen the European Union act at moments of crisis. If you look at COVID, if you look at the Euro crisis, Mario Draghi and whatever it takes, if you look at the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, these are moments when the very, very slow and lumbering European Union suddenly gets its act together. So would you agree with me, just a short answer, would you agree with me that Trump is the crisis that Europe needs to get its act together?
I do agree with you that we are acting united in crisis, right? And that is why I believe that the game changer is going to be political willingness. Today, one of the biggest challenges that we have in Europe is the fragmentation and the so-called, I call it disconnect between the European Brussels level and the member states. So what is happening, and I have experienced during the forum, speaking to some of them, is that they realize that they have two hats, right? that they have to be the leaders of their countries and their states and deal with their issues locally, but that they have a hat to lead in Europe that they have to activate very fast. So it takes political willingness to really get the EU Council united in the face of a potential crisis. Yes, I agree.
Great, okay, good. Fred, I'd like to turn to you. So this week I've been meeting with some Chinese companies, not as many here as some other years, but I've been meeting with some Chinese companies and some investors based in China. And the mood is not wonderful. When I talk to them, some companies are facing headwinds. There are some investors who are trying to restructure effectively Chinese companies to make them look more American so that they can get different deals. How are you seeing it on the ground as one of the major private investors in China? What's your sense of the relationship and how that affects the economic environment?
Well, China at the moment, China has experienced a number of years of uncertainty, economic headwinds. But as we speak, China's economy is picking up, in momentum, in growth momentum. Confidence has been dampened by up to the 3-year draconian zero COVID policies. Some of the regulatory uncertainties, and of course, rising geopolitical tension. None of it is conducive to confidence, right? But as since September last year, it's very clear the government has been resetting its priority, pivoting back to the traditional pro-growth, pro-business policy agenda. And I think that's really good news, not only for Chinese entrepreneurs, Chinese companies, multinational companies like Merck operating in China, for investors, of course, but also actually for global stability, because China, given the sheer size, is really such an important play in the world economy, and actually, source of growth, still indispensable engine to global growth. So I actually, in this triangular relationship, I'd like to actually offer a little bit of different perspective from the conventional wisdom, right? Conventional wisdom is because, if there's a rising tension between U.S. and China, Europe, we should automatically lean towards the U.S., right? Against China. Because we share democracy, cultural heritage, and we have military alliance. Of course, those are true, but this shared political system or tradition does not guarantee you have complete converging interest, okay? And does guarantee there's no conflict. In fact, the Thucydides trap, right? The ancient inspiration for Graham's famous book, the tension between ancient Athens and the Spartan, right? These are all Greek civilization, okay? Exactly identical, but they still win the war with the disastrous consequences. So, I would say right now, for European leaders, political and business, think, especially with Trump too, right? Actually, there are significant divergence in interest. For example, trade. Definitely, I think there's U.S. has turned much more protectionist. Not just Trump, okay, tariff, but Biden, exactly the same. Industrial policy, CHIPS Act, IRA, that's all highly protectionist at the expense of European companies. On tech, U.S. is bent to have unquestioned, unqualified global dominance in AI, right? What European will get it. You'll be at mercy of the 3 hyperscalers, right? And pay very high price if there's no choice, no optionality. On climate, right? So, Trump, too, is the same, which is definitely moving in opposite direction from Europe and China. On health, Trump has pulled the US out of WHO. I think it's also at odds with the European interest. Let me just, go highlight that there are divergences. I think, for Europe, being the middle, actually, is a very good position. You have flexibility, okay? You can Where it makes sense for you, you can work with the U.S. more aligned. Where you can also work with China, right? Of course, you can also compete against China if suits you. It just doesn't mean Europe has to blindly move with the U.S. in lockstep. Okay, you not to deprive yourself of freedom, of autonomy, of liberty. So my advice is more like a Charles de Gaulle advice. Okay, Europe should find a way to maintain a measure of independence with dignity, with confidence. That's in the best interest of Europe. And by the way, by extension, it's also in the best interest of the world, because the biggest danger is again keeping Graham's warning in mind is a headlong confrontation between U.S. and China, right? That will be disaster for the whole world. So Europe can do its part to prevent that from happening, by being, a confident, mediator, bridge connector, so to preserve that kind of symbiotic interconnected relationship on trade, on investment, and on other global vital interests.
Certainly, many people in Europe, including the President of France, agree with you. This is the concept of strategic autonomy for Europe, which allows Europe to play a sort of in the wind, blowing in the wind between China and US. Third pole would be a very optimistic way of putting it. I hear what all of you are saying. Obviously, the political environment has changed drastically in the last week. If you look at the cabinet of Donald Trump, it is the serious players in that cabinet are very known for their hawkish views towards China. I'm going to shamelessly rip off a phrase which I love, and I've been using it all week, and some of you may have heard it before, but don't tell the person who made it up that I'm using it. The best line I've heard about Trump 2 is that the velociraptors have learned how to open the doors this time. If you think back to the last Trump administration, the levers of government were a new and interesting tool for that administration. This time around, they've worked out how to use the levers of government, and what they want to use it for, many of them, Marco Rubio, you could go through the list, have been very outspoken in their views. So what is Europe to do? I mean, Robin, you wanted to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to come in and maybe say something about Europe, but Fred paints a positive picture as to why Europe should go back to that kind of middle position. As you know, Macron, of course, who was the big supporter of European strategic autonomy, has flipped on this since the Ukraine war, and China's support for Russia, at least through dual-use technology, through narrative support and so on, and let's say building that alternative world order that both he and Vladimir Putin have talked about, that has infuriated European leaders and diplomats. I was in Beijing back in July, toughest panel, tougher than the Americans who were there, were the Europeans. A lot of it on Ukraine, but some of it also on trade. And of course, the big fear, you're saying China is growing again. That's great, growth for China, but it's growing to eat Europe's lunch, is what it feels like in Europe. A lot of the companies, especially in Germany, but in other parts of Europe as well, are now facing an onslaught of export-led growth rather than consumption-led growth from China. And what it's doing is adding to the anxieties about China. And when you look at the kind of trade pattern here, the kind of structural element of this, bilateral trade between the US and the EU is about 1.5 trillion. EU has a surplus of roughly 150 billion in goods, which Trump always talks about, but it has a 100 billion deficit on services. So the net is about 50 billion in Europe's favor. That's very little, 1.5 trillion. EU-China trade is close to 800 billion. In 23, last time we have full official figures for, European deficit was 300 billion of that. And that's not even the most interesting number. I think the most interesting number is foreign investment. European countries and American companies' stock of foreign investment in each other's markets is 5 trillion. So, Merck and companies, $5 trillion built over the time. The stock between the EU and China is about 320 billion. It's minuscule. Now, of course, the worrying thing for Europe, you're absolutely right, Fred, that with Trump coming in, he's going, that's a dependency. I'll tax any companies that have been foolish enough to locate themselves in America if they don't, if their governments don't do nice things to our exports, because he doesn't think about trade in the same way. But I think the issue of Ukraine, where it goes, maybe Trump will take it to a different place, but the shape of the trading pattern that China and Europe had that was so positive for so long was because it was positive for Europe and sort of positive for China as well. But right now, the feeling in Brussels, at least, and European capitals I talk to, is deeply worried about China.
Can I react to this, because you said we can disagree?
Please, I want you to disagree. I said you have to disagree, in fact.
So,
Too nice.
Is this issue the consequence of China aiming to eat our lunch, or is this the consequence of the inaction in Europe for many years? Absolutely. Right? The caution, the risk aversion, the lack of investment, the fragmentation. I mean, we cannot blame anyone at this time for what has been the tonic in Europe for the last decade. Right? I was discussing yesterday with someone, and he was talking to me. He was telling me it's not 10 years, it's even more. We have talked about eurosclerosis 15 years ago, right? So honestly, I think we have to really stay on course. Do not blame anyone. Try to connect and collaborate and stay constructive. Manage our risks. Of course, manage our risks by identifying what scenarios could emerge, mainly on trade and technology, right? But we have to stay on course. We have to fill the technology gap. And for that, we need to invest, right? And for that, we need the member states to be united. We have to create an environment which is more simple, right? In which you cannot wait for 10 years to establish, a reasonable presence in hot areas like semiconductors, right? We need to think of something we have been discussing for many years, which is the Capital Markets Union, to avoid that 300 billion that we could use to foster innovation and biotechnology in Europe go abroad, right?
So
and I could continue, but I stop here.
I know, and I could join you. I follow German politics very, very closely. We are owned by Axel Springer, a German company, so I follow it very, very closely. And my argument is that Germany in particular, but I'd say it applies a bit more broadly to Europe, made three big bets. Russia for cheap energy, China for big open markets, and America for security. And my argument is those bets paid off for a while and are now big losing bets for Germany. But when I talk to German politicians, most of them, or especially the ones in power for another week or two, I find nothing but nostalgia, nothing but a wish to go back to those three bets. No other plan than please give us back our markets, our energy, and pay for our security forever. It's
I don't know who you are talking to, but this is not what I hear in Germany from the people I talk to.
The next leadership, or the current ones? Who
obviously,
the next.
The next leadership is actually obviously
there's an election, so we don't know who it is, but we can.
Exactly, we shouldn't talk about this because we are in electoral period. But what I can say, and I have witnessed that, is if there is a country in Europe that has built bridges with China at all times, this is Germany.
Well, exactly. But China is now a smaller and smaller shrinking market for the car companies and for others. And anyway, I'm going to let Professor, and then I want to give the audience a chance to ask.
So a great conversation, and you encourage us to have some contrarian views.
Of course, please.
A couple. With respect to Europe, I'm as pessimistic as you are. Sadly, I love Europe. I'm Anglophile from having the opportunities. I wish Europe would stand up and become a player. Every year, it seems a sadder story. So I'm pessimistic on the Europe piece. On the triangle, I think if we're being analytic about it, it would be worth to take the various issues and try to consider where the parties are and are likely going. And I think Jaishankar's concept of a multi-aligned world is what we're going to see among all the three parties. So with respect to green, there's going to be some quite similarities between China and Europe. And not Trump. Okay. He thinks this is a fraud, okay, a fake. If you look into international institutions, he's withdrawing from all of them. Europe and China will still be multilateral. So the WTO, the WHO, blah, blah, blah. We could go through the whole list, but I think it would be an interesting analytic exercise to see how...
You should do it.
I may do, okay, because I like the way you did it.
Publish it in Politico.
I'll come back to you. Finally, get to one that's slightly different from your view. I think obviously the consensus is that the Trump administration will look like the Republican hawk alternative to the Biden administration. And if it were the Rubio administration, that's what it would be. But I made a bit of a fuss on Tuesday, I guess, making a bet, and I'm happy to offer the bet to you if you want it as well, that a year from now, if we have the good fortune to be here, that we'll have been surprised on the upside in the relationship between the U.S. and China, because if you ask the question...
50 renminbi.
Okay, done. If you ask the question, is Donald Trump a China hawk? If you study him, you'll be shocked. Yeah?
I actually somewhat agree with you. I'd like to give Fred a chance to...
So, you're condemning Europe for, or Germany in particular, making three, big wrong bets. I respectfully disagree. Your verdict. Germany has, obviously, the biggest economy in Europe, and has benefited from being open, right, to trade, and and over the last 20 years, Merck is a very shining example. But you also mentioned German big auto companies. Has been, really, China has been the number one market, has the number one source of revenue, number one source of profits. Okay, last few years, of course, the going is getting tougher. Okay, just because of the slowing down in Chinese economy, but also the midst transition from ICE mobility to EV, right? So I think German companies are caught a little bit unprepared, but this is maybe also opportunity in disguise, because Germany, like China and Western Europe, were committed to green, right? Climate energy transition. That of course, it would be a mistake for Germany or Europe to depend on Russian gas, because we need to have renewable energy. And here, China could be really the ideal partner for Germany and Europe at large to work with, because China has managed to develop whether it's solar, wind, really, really affordable, commercially competitive source of energy without the government subsidy, right? So, and then in terms of the size of Chinese demand, there's the shrinking demand. That's totally wrong. Okay, a few years, Chinese economy is not growing as fast as it could be, but that is changing right now, and the domestic consumption in China right now, as a percent of GDP, is abnormally low. Okay, so as this normalizes, China I think to join US as really the last demand of last resort, right? So when 700 million Chinese middle class consumers start to have the confidence spend again on everything, okay, on healthcare, on mobility, on food, that China really will join US as two of the most important models. Okay, so the Chinese middle class consumers, are bigger than US and compared to the EU population. So that I think remain as it's good as Chinese economy rebalance is become more and more important source of engine.
I would respectfully correct my earlier statement. Chinese demand is shrinking or in many cases for European exports, not overall, let's say. I've got time, 2 minutes left. I'll let one person ask a question. So the lucky person, a question, not a statement, not your view, but a question to our amazing panelists. Who would like to go? Wow. You're just blinded by the brilliance. One person over there, thank you.
Magdalena Skipper, Nature. The panel's conversation was representing really mainly the perspective of Europe, to some extent the perspective of the US. What is the perspective of China? I guess it's a question to Fred.
Thank you so much. I think China's story is really rejoining the global economy. Right? Really, China lead the way for the global south. We still have low developing countries, find the path for sustainable economic development to reduce poverty, right? To really increase quality of life. In that, China also realized as China grows, has big stake in the global stability and the prosperity. So yes, I think there are a lot of frictions, differences, but China, I think, is aware of this, the stake, as a responsible stakeholder, and willing to work with the US and Europe, as partners. Here the panel would be perfect if we also have, is US, Europe, China, and the global South, right? But I think, China, I can, definitely, play a more constructive role for global stability and prosperity.
We have 17 seconds, so I think that's, unless someone would like to say something very, very short, in 15 seconds. Rob.
I'm going to be optimistic as a Brit about Europe. I think we will step up on defence. We are already. You can look at the numbers, Britain, France, Germany, others investing in big ways. I think we will be more autonomous at the end of this. We will become, rather than just the squeezed middle, I think Europe might start to have a bit more of an identity, and it is partly in the relationship with the global South. I think Europe has realised Africa is part of its future. And if you look at how the COP29 meeting went, you look at the trade agreements the EU is trying to do right now, it is trying to find a different route that gives me some optimism for the future. And I want to put that down as a Brit.
So I'll go on the other side of that bet as well.
Fine, go for it.
And that's 50 euros.
Euros,
yeah.
How about, I'd rather do pounds, actually.
No.
On Fred's comment, I think it's a very important one. I mean, if we try to think of it in terms of the globe, there's 8 billion people. So there's the US, there's China, there's the EU, and there's the global majority.
Yeah.
Not just the South.
Absolutely.
They don't happen to have much voice,
point.
but I think that in the big picture.
For another panel. Thank you so much to my amazing panelists.